My name is Sandra Steve. I'm 34. I was still bleeding when she put the papers in my hands. The room smelled like antiseptic and metal. My vision kept dimming at the edges, the way it does when you're trying not to pass out. A nurse had just said something about my blood pressure and then stepped away. I remember the weight of the clipboard settling onto my lap, heavier than it should have been. My mother-in-law stood on the other side of the bed, calm, neat, almost cheerful. She smiled at me like this was a favor, like she was helping. "Just sign," she said softly. "It's a small correction." My hands were shaking. I could feel the stitches pull when I shifted, a slow, hot pain that made it hard to focus on the words in front of me. I was still foggy from medication, still trying to register that they'd rushed me into surgery, that my body had nearly failed me an hour earlier. She angled the pen into my fingers when I didn't move fast enough. I remember thinking I should ask where my husband was. I remember deciding not to waste the breath. I focused instead on keeping my eyes open, on breathing evenly, on not letting the room tilt again. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "This just makes things cleaner, for the baby." The paper blurred. I saw my name printed where it always was. I didn't see what else was there. I signed because my arm was heavy and because she was still smiling and because I needed the moment to be over. She gathered the pages immediately, stacking them with practiced care, like this was something she'd done before. Then she touched my shoulder briefly and stepped back. I didn't say anything. I closed my eyes and listened to the monitors instead, counting the beeps until they steadied again. I didn't realize then what that signature would trigger. The pressure didn't stop after that. It settled in, quiet but constant. When the nurse came back, my mother-in-law had already taken the clipboard with her. She stood near the window now, scrolling on her phone, her posture relaxed. I noticed she'd moved my bag off the chair and set it closer to the wall, like she was organizing the room while I lay there unable to sit up on my own. I asked where my husband was. My voice came out thin. She didn't look up. "He ran home for a minute," she said. "Insurance things, you don't need to worry about it." Another nurse adjusted my IV. Someone asked me to rate my pain. I gave a number that felt safe, not too high, not too low. The medication made time stretch and fold in on itself. Every few minutes, my mother-in-law would step closer to the bed, check a screen, straighten the blanket, move something that didn't need moving. She answered questions that weren't directed at her. When my phone buzzed on the bedside table, she picked it up before I could reach it. She glanced at the screen, then set it face down. "You should rest," she said. "I'll handle things." I let my eyes close again, not because I trusted her, but because my body wouldn't cooperate anymore. Fighting took more energy than I had. Later, when my husband finally came back, she was already explaining things to him in a low, steady voice. I caught pieces of it. Paperwork. Timing. How hard the day had been. He looked overwhelmed, nodding as if she were helping carry something heavy. I watched him from the bed, his shoulders tense, his attention pulled toward her instead of me. When he reached for my hand, she was the one who answered when the nurse asked a question. When a form appeared, she pointed to where he should sign. When he hesitated, she touched his arm, just long enough to move him along. I stayed quiet. I focused on small things, the rise and fall of my chest, the hum of the lights, the way the room felt too full even when no one was speaking. By the time they wheeled me to recovery, the sense that something had shifted was already there. Not loud, not dramatic. Just present. The first sign came quietly. 2 days later, a woman I didn't recognize stepped into my hospital room with a folder tucked against her chest. She wore a blazer that didn't quite fit the setting, and she kept glancing at her phone like she was on a schedule. My mother-in-law followed her in, already mid-sentence, already explaining. "This won't take long," she said before anyone had asked. The woman introduced herself as being with the title office. She didn't sit down. She set the folder on the rolling tray and flipped it open, her finger tapping a line near the bottom of the page. "Just need a signature here," she said, looking at my mother-in-law instead of me. I remember noticing the date first. It wasn't that day, it was earlier. I asked what it was for. My voice sounded more like a question than I intended. My mother-in-law answered smoothly. "It's the adjustment we talked about, to get everything aligned." She slid the tray closer to the bed, careful not to jostle me. The pen was placed in my hand again, the same way as before, guided, practiced. The woman from the title office shifted her weight, watching the door, not my face. I signed because my head was still foggy, and because everyone around me was acting like this was routine. But when the woman closed the folder, I saw the edge of another page beneath it, my name printed once, then again, and not where I expected it to be. After they left, I asked for a copy. A nurse said it would be added to my discharge paperwork. It was. When we finally went home days later, the front door didn't open with our key. There was a new lock. I stood there, still sore, still weak, holding my baby, while my husband knocked like a guest. From the end of the driveway, I could see a sign staked into the lawn. White background, red letters. I didn't know yet how it had all been done. I only knew it hadn't ended in that hospital room. Standing on the porch, with nowhere to go, made certain things line up. It wasn't the first time she'd fixated on the house. From the beginning, she'd treated it like a temporary arrangement that needed correcting. When we bought it years earlier, a plain 4-bedroom place on a quiet street, she asked whose name was on the deed before she asked how we liked it. When she found out it was mine, she laughed once and said, "That won't last." It came up again and again after that. At holidays, in passing, always framed as concern. She liked to remind me that families were safer when things were shared properly. When I didn't respond, she'd look to my husband instead. One afternoon, months before I gave birth, I came home to find 2 people in our living room I didn't recognize. She'd brought them by, she said, just friends curious about the layout. They walked through slowly, asking questions about the roof and the basement. I stood in the kitchen holding my keys, waiting for someone to acknowledge me. Later, she asked for a spare key. She said it was for emergencies. I didn't give her one. She smiled anyway. During my pregnancy, the comments sharpened. She talked about space, about how a baby changed things, about how paperwork should be settled before it was too late. She brought printed forms with her once, sliding them across the table like suggestions. I didn't read them. I pushed them back. I remember one night, not long before my due date, when my husband told me she'd explained something important to him, about protecting the baby, about making sure everything was secure if anything happened to me. He looked uneasy, but he trusted her. He always had. I told him we could look at it later. We didn't. By the time we were standing outside our own house, locked out, it was clear those weren't isolated moments. They were rehearsals, small tests to see what she could move without resistance. I shifted the baby higher against my chest and watched my husband knock again, harder this time. No one answered. Labor started earlier than expected. I remember the rain on the windshield and how my husband kept glancing at his phone while we drove. His mother was already there when we arrived, somehow ahead of us, already speaking with the front desk like she belonged there. Things moved quickly after that. Hours blurred together. At some point, my husband set his phone down on the chair beside the bed. Later, when I reached for it, it wasn't there anymore. I saw her with it across the room, thumbs moving, her back turned slightly, like she didn't want to be interrupted. I didn't have the energy to ask. After the baby was born, everything tilted. I remember the sudden rush, the change in voices, the lights feeling too bright. Someone said I was bleeding more than they liked. Someone else pressed hard on my abdomen. Then they were moving me fast, telling my husband they needed to take me to surgery. I didn't see his face when they wheeled me away. When I woke up again, it was quiet in a way that didn't feel reassuring. My throat was dry. My body felt wrong, heavy, and distant. A nurse told me I'd lost a lot of blood, but they'd stabilized me. She said I needed to rest. Not long after that, my mother-in-law leaned over me and said my husband had to run home. She said there were insurance forms that couldn't wait. She said she'd stay. I drifted in and out. In one of the clearer moments, I noticed my bag wasn't where I'd left it. It was open, tucked under the chair. My wallet was on top instead of zipped inside. I remember thinking I should move it, then deciding it didn't matter. By the time I was more awake, she was sitting calmly, flipping through a magazine, my bag closed again at her feet. I didn't see my husband until much later. In the days that followed, I learned in pieces what I hadn't been present for. That she'd shown him papers while I was unconscious, telling him they were medical forms. That she'd told him it was urgent, that signing quickly would help me, would protect the baby if something went wrong. That he'd signed because he was scared and exhausted and because she sounded certain. When the woman from the title office came to my room, I was still on pain medication. I hadn't slept properly. I was told it was a small correction. I was told it would make things easier. Between my signature and his, everything they needed was there. By the time we were discharged, the locks had already been ordered. The house wasn't ours anymore. We just didn't know it yet. The door finally opened from the inside. A man I'd never seen before stood there, holding a clipboard, the chain still latched. He looked past us, toward the car, then back at my husband like we were already an inconvenience. "This is a bad time," he said. My mother-in-law stepped forward before either of us could speak. She told him it was fine. She told him we were just picking up a few things. She said it lightly, like she'd already cleared it. The chain came off. Inside, the house smelled different. Not dirty, just unfamiliar. The hallway rug was gone. The framed photo from the entry table had been moved. Someone else's boots were by the door. A second man walked out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag. He nodded at my mother-in-law like they'd already met. She turned to us then, her tone calm and practical. She said my husband had made a decision while I was in the hospital. She said it was about space, about timing. She said the house had been sold so we could move forward. I didn't argue. I sat down slowly on the stairs because my legs were shaking and because the baby was getting heavy. My husband kept asking questions that didn't get answered. The men exchanged looks instead. One of them said we had 48 hours to clear out what was ours. He said it like he was doing us a favor by giving notice. When the police arrived, they didn't raise their voices. They asked for paperwork. The men produced it. My name was on the pages, clean and unquestioned. The officers said it was a civil matter. They said we needed a lawyer. While they were still there, my mother-in-law told us she'd already arranged a place for us. A small apartment. Just for now, she said it would help us get back on our feet. I watched her adjust the blanket around my baby, careful not to wrinkle it, like she was tidying up after a mess she hadn't made. That night, we slept somewhere else. The house lights stayed on behind us as we drove away. The apartment she'd chosen was quiet in the wrong way. It was clean, small, and already furnished, like it had never belonged to anyone for very long. I moved slowly, careful with my stitches, careful with the baby. My husband stood in the middle of the room, his hands empty, like he didn't know where to put them. That first night, he didn't sleep. He sat at the table scrolling through his phone, stopping every few minutes to run a hand over his face. He kept saying he must have misunderstood something, that she wouldn't have gone that far. In the morning, his sister called. She didn't ease into it. She asked where we were. When he told her, there was a long pause on the line. Then she said a name, someone she trusted, someone who handled property disputes, and told him to call immediately. By noon, we were sitting across from a woman with sharp eyes and a desk covered in files. She didn't interrupt while we spoke. She asked for every document we had. When there were gaps, she noted them without comment. She pointed to dates that didn't align. She asked about medication. She asked who had access to my identification while I was hospitalized. When she finally spoke, it was measured. She said the signatures raised concerns. She said my condition mattered. She said we needed to act quickly. She filed something that afternoon, an emergency order, she called it. She told us not to confront anyone. She told us to document everything. Photos, times, names. A man she worked with contacted us later that day. He asked for the address of the house and the names of the people we'd seen there. He didn't sound surprised when we gave them. That evening, my mother-in-law showed up at the apartment with bags of baby supplies. She talked about how stressful everything had been. She said she was only trying to help. My husband stood up before she finished. He told her to leave. He said not to come back until she took responsibility for what she'd done. She looked at me then, just once, like she was checking whether I'd asked him to say that. I hadn't. When the door closed behind her, the room felt smaller. But it was the first time since the hospital that it also felt steady. The order came through 2 days later. We sat in the back of the courtroom while our attorney spoke. I stayed seated the entire time, hands folded, the baby asleep against my chest. Across the room, the man who claimed to own our house leaned back in his chair like he was waiting out a delay. My mother-in-law wasn't there. The judge asked a few questions, mostly about timing, about signatures, about my medical condition on the day the papers were signed. He looked down at the dates, then back at me, and paused longer than he needed to. The order was granted, temporary, immediate. Work on the house had to stop. No more changes. No selling, no refinancing, no transfers until things were reviewed properly. It didn't give us the house back, it just froze it in place. That afternoon, the man working with our attorney drove by the property. He took photos of fresh lumber stacked near the garage and half-installed fixtures inside. He told us to keep every message, every receipt, every missed call. He didn't have to dig long. The man listed on the sale paperwork had a history, not a single mistake but a pattern, jobs left unfinished, lawsuits that settled quietly, a contractor's license that no longer existed. There was a former partner who'd walked away years earlier and was willing to talk. He remembered names. He remembered dates. He remembered being pushed out after questioning a deal that looked too clean on paper. None of it surprised our attorney. What did surprise me was how quickly the costs added up. Filing fees, retainers, time off work my husband couldn't really afford. We talked one night about whether we should just take whatever offer came first and end it. The next morning, someone at my husband's job asked why he looked exhausted. By the end of the week, his coworkers had set up a fundraiser without telling us. They shared it quietly. It filled faster than I expected. It bought us time. The investigator sent another update a few days later. He'd pulled credit reports tied to my mother-in-law. The numbers didn't make sense for someone who claimed she was only helping. Cards maxed out, late notices, a mortgage on her own place that was weeks from default. Then came the emails. Printed out, lined up, months old. They laid out the plan in plain language, what the house was worth, how quickly it needed to move, what she'd be paid when it did. Our attorney forwarded everything to the district attorney's office. After that, the calls stopped feeling like delays. They started sounding like preparation. She came back once more after that. It was late afternoon. I was feeding the baby when there was a knock at the apartment door, soft, careful, like she didn't want to be overheard. I didn't get up. My husband did. She stood there with a paper bag in each hand. Diapers, formula we hadn't asked for. A folded blanket draped over her arm like an offering. She smiled in a way that suggested confusion, as if she couldn't understand why things felt strained. "I just wanted to check on you," she said. "I know this has all been so stressful." My husband didn't step aside. He didn't invite her in. She talked anyway, about misunderstandings, about how lawyers made everything feel worse than it was, about how none of this needed to get so complicated. She said she'd only stepped in because she thought we needed help. She said anyone would have done the same. I watched from the couch. She never looked at me directly. She addressed the room instead, as if I were still too fragile to include. When she finally paused, my husband told her this wasn't a misunderstanding. He said what she'd done had consequences. He said she wasn't welcome around us or the baby until she took responsibility for all of it. Her face tightened just slightly. She glanced past him toward me, searching for something, permission maybe. I didn't move. She set the bags down anyway, neatly against the wall. She said she hoped we'd come to our senses. Then she left without waiting for an answer. My husband carried the bags back outside and placed them next to the door. He didn't say anything when he came back in. The next step came from the district attorney's office. A detective called, asking for a detailed account. He wanted dates, names, what I remembered of the hospital stay, who had been in the room, what paperwork I'd seen. I spoke slowly, deliberately, noting the gaps and the moments I had missed. He asked about my condition, about when I'd been medicated, about the signatures. I answered each question with as much clarity as I could manage, keeping the baby on my lap, pausing only when he asked me to. Later, he called back to confirm a few details. Then he asked if he could interview the title agent. She was hesitant at first, but eventually admitted that she had felt uneasy during the transaction. She'd noticed inconsistencies in the dates and signatures, noticed the rush, noticed the pressure from the contractor. She confirmed that someone had insisted the papers be completed immediately. All of it added up. The detective also gathered my mother-in-law's financial records and the emails between her and the contractor. The messages were explicit: dates, amounts, instructions, the promise of $25,000 if the house was moved as planned. Every step of the scheme was documented. When he summarized it over the phone, he described it as one of the worst examples of exploitation he'd seen. That didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was how much evidence there already existed before we even started pressing charges. I filed copies of the emails and notes with my attorney. Every receipt, every time-stamped photo from the house, every message from my husband's phone became part of the record. Each piece was another weight on the plan that had been laid against us. I began to realize then that what had seemed like an unstoppable tide, the house gone, the locks changed, the contractor inside, was now something that could be undone. The quiet work of evidence gathering had shifted the momentum. It was slow, it was tedious, but it was moving. By the time the investigation was in full swing, my body was sending messages I couldn't ignore. I woke one morning with a pounding headache, swelling in my hands, and a sharp, persistent pressure in my chest. My husband insisted we go to the hospital immediately. They admitted me for postpartum preeclampsia. I spent the next few days on strict monitoring, blood pressure readings every few hours, IV medication, and near-constant observation. The stress hadn't been subtle. Even with the legal team managing most of the work, the uncertainty, the constant tracking of documents, the emails, the calls, it had seeped into every corner of my life. My body felt like it was carrying the weight of more than just recovery from childbirth. I remember lying in the hospital bed, the baby asleep at home under my husband's care, thinking about the house, the locks, the signatures, and my mother-in-law's calm insistence. The pattern of pressure, the constant manipulation, it was tangible now, not just in memory, but in swelling, in readings on a monitor, in the sharp reminders from doctors that stress could be as dangerous as anything else I'd experienced. Even lying there, I could feel the momentum of the investigation building around us, threading through the medical reports, through the emails, through the testimonies. It gave me a strange steadiness, proof that despite my body warning me otherwise, the work we had started could not be undone by fear or fatigue. The pressure finally broke in our favor. Weeks after the restraining order, our attorney called with news. The contractor's legal team had decided not to fight. The evidence against him was too strong, and he was facing the real possibility of jail time if the case went to trial. He agreed to a settlement on our terms. The house would be returned entirely to me. Legal fees, moving costs, and compensation for the months of stress and upheaval were included in the agreement, giving us the financial space to recover. The contractor later entered a guilty plea. He received probation and was ordered to pay restitution to other victims he had defrauded over the years. It wasn't an easy process to follow through on, but step by step, it was happening. The house, which had felt so fragile under the weight of someone else's manipulation, was ours again, legally, completely. I remember walking through each room with my attorney's documents in hand, noting that the locks were finally secure, the sale completely invalidated. The nursery furniture, the personal touches we had carefully put in place before the ordeal, were untouched. The evidence of the struggle, the half-finished renovations, scattered tools, remained, but it didn't matter anymore. We had reclaimed what was ours, and the system had recognized it. There was relief, yes, but also a lingering awareness of the months of manipulation, the boundaries crossed, and the trust we would need to rebuild. Yet in that space, I could already feel the first threads of steadiness returning. My mother-in-law's life changed quietly but completely. After the criminal investigation, she was charged as an accomplice to the fraud. She received probation, community service, and was ordered to pay restitution, $12,000, part of the money she had hoped to earn from the scheme. She never received the payout promised by the contractor, and the collapse of that plan left her finances exposed. Her condo, once a comfortable home, had to be sold to cover mounting debts. She moved into a much smaller apartment. From the outside, the neighborhood looked ordinary, but it was clear that the stability she had relied on was gone. When we finally saw her, it was during one of the routine exchanges for paperwork, brief and formal. She spoke in neutral tones, careful not to overstep, careful not to suggest the past could be rewritten. We didn't invite her inside. We didn't speak more than necessary. The control she had once wielded over our house, over our family, even over my husband's judgment, was gone. Every calculated step she had taken to manipulate us had been documented and countered. She could no longer influence our lives in the ways she had. Her outcome, in its quiet way, mirrored the work we had done to reclaim ours. Slow, deliberate, and undeniable. By the time the last boxes were unpacked, the house had settled back into its rhythm. Morning light spilled through the windows in the nursery. The baby cooed softly in his crib. I sat in the rocking chair, nursing him, and let my gaze drift over the familiar corners: the shelf where his toys waited, the window sill where the sunlight hit the carpet just right. Everything bore the marks of life we had chosen, not the chaos imposed from outside. My husband moved through the kitchen, making coffee. He paused to check the locks, then ran his hand along the countertop, smoothing away dust. We didn't speak about what had happened unless necessary. The story of the theft, the legal battles, the manipulation, it had its place in files, in memories, in court records. But here, it had no voice. I carried the baby from room to room, pausing in the living room to set him down on a blanket. I ran a hand along the banister, worn smooth from years of careful use. Everything was quiet, steady, unremarkable in the best way. It wasn't triumph or celebration. It was simply the house returning to its purpose, a home for our family. And in that quiet, I finally let myself exhale. Thanks for watching. If it resonated with you, consider subscribing and liking the video. Every subscriber helps me share more real stories, honestly as they really happened.